I am going to address a set of questions that I think we've been circling around in the discussion of gender budgets and of gender mainstreaming, of which gender budgeting is a part for quite some time. Let me tell you what that is. In 1992, as you may remember, Bhanwari Devi, a Dalit Sathin of the Women's Development Program in Rajasthan, in the process of doing her work, which at that time involved motivating and persuading villagers to give up the practice of child marriage. And the villagers had been, in fact, quite happy with Bhanwari Devi's work up until that point. All of the things that she'd been doing had found favor, but this one didn't. As part of her doing that work, she was gang raped. And the Bhanwari Devi case, of course, has been seen by women's groups and the women's movement more generally as a watershed mark. Bhanwari Devi herself suffered stigma and increased discrimination from then onwards, and in fact grew quite bitter with some of the women's organizations who took up her case and then used it to advocate for changes in legislation. But be that as it may, and it is quite often the case with, especially in our country, if they are poor Dalit women who somehow get caught in the crosshairs between advancing the larger strategic interests of women and their own personal lives and the way in which they get caught. But be that as it may, it certainly was a watershed case. The Supreme Court, as we know, passed the Vishakha guidelines as a result of advocacy which began with the Bhanwari Devi case and which basically addressed the case as a case of sexual abuse and harassment in the workplace, because this was Bhanwari Devi's workplace within which it had happened, leading then, of course, to further advocacy and activism, the passing of a law that we know all about, etc., which I don't plan to particularly get into around sexual harassment in the workplace. Bhanwari Devi's case was a watershed in linking the world of work to the politics and the world of the body in ways that women's groups and the women's movement had been struggling to do for a number of years. It was not a watershed on all aspects of reproduction or of women's bodies, because it took many decades before child marriage as such has finally, in fact, begun to disappear in parts of Rajasthan. It's only now that the evidence seems to be emerging that those, in the case for which Bhanwari Devi was punished by the villagers, was in fact of the marriage of a 9-month-old girl. Those cases are in fact disappearing, but it's taken a long time, and we don't know whether the Bhanwari Devi case had much to do with this at all, or whether it's part of a larger social changes that are taking place. So it was not a watershed in terms of all aspects of women's lives and bodies, but it certainly was a watershed in terms of beginning to recognize that work and the body, the politics of the body, are inseparable when it comes particularly to women and women's participation in work, their experiences at work, the constraints they face in the realm of work. For that, it was, I think, an important watershed. Since the 1970s on, women's groups had been addressing both worlds, the world of work and the world of the body, in a variety of different ways. If we think about the 1970s and the anti-dowry movement of the 1970s, the movement against top-down and coercive population control, family planning control programs, the movements against child marriage and sati, however ineffectual they may have been for quite some time on the one side, and then on the other side, by both in the 1970s, but increasingly in the following decade of the 1980s, we have such watersheds as the 1987-88 Shram Shakti report of the National Commission on Self-Employed Women and women in the informal sector, which provided a searing understanding of what women experience in the world of work. I was looking at Shram Shakti again just recently to remind myself, and I wanted to see how much and whether they had actually talked about the world of sex and reproduction. And there's very little in Shram Shakti about that. But the first words of Shram Shakti are, "There is no work, yet the grind of work is killing me." The searing reality, as I said, of the working lives of women, which led the Shram Shakti report on its first page to note, after having to spend 23 years breaking stones and head loading, or peeling and beating coir for 18 years, or being born into a migrant road crew, or carrying toxic sulfur powder for 7 years, all for a fraction of the legal minimum wage. The Shram Shakti report goes on that very first page to indict not only the invisibility of such work and the invisibility of the women workers doing such work, but also the insensitivity of officialdom. And the report did it in no uncertain terms, in a manner that I think we would find hard to see in today's world. It talked about the insensitivity of officialdom towards the realities and the lives of poor working women. Today's seminar has the title Strengthening State Effectiveness for Gender-Inclusive Development, and I believe that Shram Shakti had something for us in that context. What is it that needs to be done? And it is this that I particularly want to come back to, how we might think of doing this and what it is that we need to do in the context of thinking about gender mainstreaming and gender budgeting. We know that, of course, between the time 87-88 and the Shram Shakti report, and now many issues, such as childcare, have entered laws, programs, and so on. But many others, such as unpaid care work, really have not. Sometimes you see them, sometimes you don't. The NSS counts the data, but who cares about the NSS surveys on domestic work. In fact, my most recent experience with this was at the United Nations in New York during the Commission on the Status of Women, when women advocates were trying to get unpaid care work into the final outcome document of the Commission on the Status of Women. And the young male Indian delegate, luckily for him, I've forgotten his name, simply could not understand that what women do in the home is work. He said, अरे तो ये प्यार से करते हैं, जो करते हैं प्यार से करते हैं, अपनी फैमिली के लिए करते हैं, इसको क्यों यहाँ ले आ रहे हैं तुम लोग? So no amount of saying हाँ प्यार से तो करते हैं, लेकिन करने में कभी मरते भी हैं, तो उसलिए तो हम इसको बीच में ले आ रहे हैं. But he just could not understand it. This was a young man who was definitely not above 35 years of age. And if a young man of 35 years of age who's representing the country at that level cannot understand the nature and the meaning of unpaid care work and why it has to be part of how we think about gender mainstreaming and gender budgets, then something we've been doing has not worked. Or maybe we haven't done it enough. We have done many things, however, from the viewpoint of programs. As we know, the Women's Development Program in Rajasthan was a precursor for Mahila Samakhya, Mahila Samata, whatever name it has been given in different states. The program whose central focus, drawing partly from the WDP experience, but also from a whole churning and debate within the women's movement and between women's organizations and the government functionaries who were very keen to understand how to move this forward, that women need to become the agents of their own change. And that they need to become the agents of that change in their own lives. And I think that this relates a little bit to what both Bina was saying earlier and which Dr. Sen referred to in his closing remarks. It's very interesting, therefore, to see how the new book, based on a detailed evaluation of the Mahila Samakhya program in Bihar, assesses how the program worked in Bihar. And I would recommend this book to everyone here, government functionaries or not, because it has literally just come out. The actual book hasn't even hit the stands yet, but it makes for fascinating reading because it provides insights about a relatively large-scale attempt at mainstreaming gender, which had consistent support from women's groups and organizations through its entire lifetime, less consistent support from government, which of course finally led to its actually being closed down a few years back, but a set of insights that emerged through the roller coaster that the Mahila Samakhya program went through, which gives us a lot of understanding about where we might need to go from here. So strengthening state effectiveness. What's next? I want to start this part of my talk with two You might call them sayings, aphorisms, whatever you like. The first one is, talk is cheap, follow the money. And the second is the name of a very, very well-loved Beatles song from the 1960s, which said, "Money can't buy me love." These two, I feel, in a way, summarize the challenges that we face with the issue of gender budgeting today. For women's empowerment, money and budgets are clearly necessary. And 5%, which is where this gender budget has been hovering, at 5% of the total budget for 50% of the population, simply doesn't cut it. It's not enough money. But my concern here is not about the question of whether the money is enough or not, so much as the question of, even if we were to increase this, let's say, I don't believe it's going to happen, but let's say to 10% over the next 5 years or 10 years, give it 10 years, 10%, it wouldn't be sufficient in itself because of the politics of the body. When it comes to women and work, it's not only the public sphere of work that matters and how much money we might put into the public sphere of work, but what happens in the private sphere of families, where the amalgam of work and body, sex, including abuse and incest and violence, and reproduction, childbearing, and the care of human beings, what women's organizations call care work, are mingled together in ways that have dramatic implications for how women participate in work and what work means for women in ways that are very, very different than what work means for men. As much as we speak about gender equality, these mean two very, very different things by gender, for men and for women. The norm behavior in the private sphere, if you think about it, within families, behavioral norms are almost entirely for girls and women. We don't talk about the good boy, the good man, but we always talk perennially about the good girl and the good woman. Those norms of behavior are in fact what the Mahila Samakya evaluation for Bihar found to be the basic constraints. Mahila Samakya is a program, and many of you are probably aware of it, that in fact learned from the women's movement and the experiences of women's groups to broaden its ambit to cover a range of issues. And some of those it did quite well, particularly those that had to do with bringing poor and often Dalit women together in ways that they could in fact empower themselves, somewhat along the lines of what Beena Agarwal was saying about group farming. But the evaluation found two constraints, and that's very important for us to note. The first one was family and marriage. Now, was there no change in family and marriage norms? No, there was change. the age at marriage for girls under the Mahila Samakya program did go up. But equally, marriage was still seen as the girl's destiny. Nothing else. It was that for which she was born. Educating her some more would make her reduce the dowry need, perhaps, make her better available, perhaps, not always, in the marriage market. Second, violence against women as a norm, as an accepted norm, was viewed as not okay in general, but still okay if a woman had an abortion without telling her husband, or if the husband, with valid or invalid reasons, suspected her of infidelity. Whose views are these? They're the views of the girls and women. So as much as empowerment happened in a variety of ways, it was thus far and no further. So our first challenge, I think, continues to be this relationship. What a woman can do, where she can go to work, can she be in situations where the family honor is in danger? All of these things impact on what she can earn, where she can work, how she can work, with whom she can work, where she can go. And these connections between, this is what I'm calling the connections and the constraints between the world of work and the world of the body, the politics of the body. Let me then turn to the last set of comments that I have, which is towards gender transformative budgets. And I know I have to tell you about the second lesson from the evaluation, which is what I'm coming to now. The Mahila Samakya evaluation came up with a lot of really interesting lessons. The importance of clear principles in a government program that identify and understand what is the meaning of gender equality and mainstreaming. What's this gender budget for, other than being able to show a larger number in a budget table? What is it intended to do, and what are its non-negotiables? One of Mahila Samakya's biggest strengths was its ability to identify non-negotiables. This we will not do. Caste discrimination we will not tolerate within our sanghas. So the creation of non-negotiables was seen as being very important in the empowerment process set off within Mahila Samakya, important for its processes of learning and self-reflexivity, both for individuals and the organization. Another very important element in terms of programming and what we do with the money that we may get out of a gender budget was flexibility and time. There was a constant struggle within Mahila Samakya around the bureaucratization of the program and the struggle over time. We need to see results. We need to see results within the next 2 annual cycles. And these are not programs that will show those kinds of results. Imagine trying to tell Bhanwari Devi that she has to change what the Rajasthan villagers think about child marriage within the next 2 budget cycles. Not possible. The kind of changes that we are talking about here have to allow and be given time. That is something that the political financial cycle is very chary of, and that is something that following the political cycle, the bureaucratic cycle is also finds it very difficult to do. But it is required, because for these kinds of changes, you cannot make them happen in a hurry. And the most important, of course, was women's own agency. That a gender budget comes to have meaning through programs where women themselves are agents. Without women's agency, you don't have the mal of the program, the substance of the program that will actually take it forward. So, 2 big questions. Someone might ask, and I may be preempting a question, can gender norms really be changed through public policy? Or is this something that we have to wait for the tectonic shifts of social change to bring about over 50 or 100 years or so? Well, the problem is we don't have the luxury of such tectonic changes because we don't know what might happen in 50 or 100 years. We may still be exactly where we are right now if we just let it be. The answer of the evaluators was to say that being able to change gender norms through public policy is not a mirage. It can happen. And we can see areas where it can happen. But it's going to be long drawn out and may well be hard fought. And for it, therefore, to succeed, you need to know what are the entry points in the program. I don't want to take more time to go through all of the different entry points, but let me just address 1 or 2 of them. Back somewhere in the 1980s, and I was trying to remember when it was, I've actually done a paper for the Commonwealth Secretariat on gender mainstreaming in the finance ministry. Now, I don't know why I picked the short straw in this lot, because the Commonwealth Secretariat was doing a whole series of papers, gender mainstreaming in the health ministry, in the education ministry, in the power and transportation ministry. I landed up with what I believe, and everybody else believed as well, was the most difficult of the lot, which was the finance ministry. What I said then, I think I was going back and looking at it and saying, does it really make sense? I still believe in as being important. And that is the invisibility of the women themselves and the insensitivity of officialdom. I'm not talking about individuals here. I'm talking about the systems that we set up that make it very difficult then to address the realities of women's lives. That needs to change. The adequacy, what am I saying here? All of our programs focus a great deal on sensitizing women, empowering women. Some of our programs, girls included, some of our programs now have gone to the extent of saying it's not enough to empower women, they're not the problem. You need to look at boys and men. They are the ones who need change. But I want to take one step further. I think for our gender budgets to go from being simply a number, which is an allocation, which may or may not actually, we're talking allocations here, which may or may not be spent, which is a whole different thing, as we know. We need to sensitize those who are program managers, those who are running policies, and for whom, those who have never read Shram Shakti, who might say, we see it on the ground and so we know all about it. No, you don't. And that will come just like everything else, with a form of capacity building. It doesn't have to do with whether you're men or women. We all have structural positions that make it difficult for us then to follow what is going on in a different structural position. And I would argue, therefore, to sum up, that we have three things that we need to pay attention to in moving forward from where we are on gender budgets. The first, of course, is the adequacy of budgets themselves. 5% doesn't cut it. And as Dr. Sen said, we don't even pay attention to what the states are doing in this regard. The second, however, is that money can't buy you love. For women, the importance of programs linking work and income with the transformation of norms within households and communities, and the full integration of such issues as care work, reproduction, and violence, not sitting as silos in separate programs, but fundamentally into, as a composite, into the heart of our thinking around gender budgets. And the third is the capacity building of program officials so that they can, in fact, transcend what Shram Shakti had to say about them 25 years ago. Thank you very much.